afternoon. I'm Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of this year's Dean's Conversation series. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you in the months to come. As you probably know, this is a really, really special year for the School of Public Health. We're celebrating a decade of the existence of the school, a decade of impact, a decade of great education of students like many of you. Throughout the year, we're going to have seminars and lectures and community gatherings. We had a great kickoff event yesterday, so it's going to be a great year. Now, this afternoon's conversation I'm very excited about. It's with Dean Jha, of course, and it features former White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, and they'll be discussing the pandemic and preparing for future public health challenges, the impact of political polarization, and more. And my job today, and it's my honor to do it, is to introduce Ron Klain. He has served as a key advisor to 3 US presidents, most recently as Chief of Staff to President Biden, and that's a post he stepped down from earlier this year. He called it the best job he's ever had, so I'd like to hear more about that. In a recent New Yorker article, he said if he learned anything in the role, it was the power of, quote, persistence and not panicking. So Ron is recognized as an authority on matters of government, law, and public affairs. As Chief of Staff in the White House, he oversaw the administration's COVID-19 response. He contributed to major legislative accomplishments, including the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And he previously led the Obama administration's response to the Ebola virus. He does a few other things. In between his time in government, he's worked as a partner at a law firm, an executive vice president and general counsel of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, and he's taught at Harvard Law School and at Georgetown University. He holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown and a law degree from Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming Dean Jha and Ron Klain. Thank you.
Around this thing.
Great.
Ron, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Ashish, and thank you, President Paxson, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here.
First visit to Brown?
First visit ever to Brown.
Yay. Well, let's make it a good one.
All right.
Did pretty well on the weather. So I'd love to start off. Chris gave the thumbnail sketch of your career, obviously your last role, but if you could start a little earlier.
Sure.
And just spend a couple of minutes walking us through how you got to be where you are, the early days of kind of your interest in getting involved in the political process, people you've worked with, kind of lessons learned, and then we can dive more into the COVID pandemic, Ebola, and all the other stuff that I want to get to. But I think it'd be just helpful for people to have a bit of a broader arc of your career.
Well, thanks, Ashish. So I was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, and went to public high school there, and I was interested in politics from a young age, and so I applied to and went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where I worked on Capitol Hill while I was in college. And then when I graduated, I went to work for then Congressman Ed Markey, who represented then Massachusetts 7th District in Congress. And while I was on his staff after college, he ran for the U.S. Senate in 1984, and I worked on his campaign. Ultimately, he dropped out of that race and ran for re-election instead. But the people I met on his campaign in 1984 were key political advisors to Senator Biden as he started gearing up for his presidential campaign in 1988. So I then went to law school, and during the summers while I was in law school, I went to work on Senator Biden's presidential campaign in 1986 and 1987. I graduated from law school, served as a law clerk, and then went to work on, in 1989, went to work on Senator Biden's Senate staff in the Judiciary Committee, worked there for 3 years, left there, went to work on the Clinton campaign in 1992. We won. I went to work at the White House, and then other stuff after that. That's the early phase.
And obviously one of the key people you worked with during the Clinton years was Vice President Gore.
Yes.
Talk a little bit more about that relationship with Vice President Gore.
Yeah. So I came into the White House in 1993 working in the counsel's office. I was in charge of judicial selection, and got to know Vice President Gore because he had some interest in that too. And then in 1995, when his chief of staff left, he hired me to be his chief of staff, and so I spent the last year of the first term of the Clinton-Gore administration as Vice President Gore's chief of staff, and stayed in that role till 1999, when his campaign for president got underway, and I wound up leaving his staff, and then went to work in law practice, and eventually came back and rejoined the campaign and oversaw our efforts in the 2000 recount after that contested election.
All right, so we won't keep going down this path much longer. I just want to, so you've broad experience working in the federal government, certainly working some in Congress, a lot in the executive branch.
Yeah, both.
Let's fast forward now to 2020.
Yeah.
It's fall of 2020.
Yeah.
President-elect Biden has just been elected. We're in the pretty bad days, heading towards the worst days.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear we're heading into the worst days. Yeah. There's a lot to do. We've got a president in office who's not super excited about leaving his office, as I recall.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. I'm not sure anybody's super excited about leaving that office, but he seemed particularly not excited about leaving that office. And, you know, the economy was facing substantial headwinds. And you just had a sense that the challenges were extraordinary. In that broad set of challenges that you were going to have to confront as the incoming chief of staff to the incoming president, how did you think about the pandemic?
Yeah.
How does it get prioritized in that set of priorities? And then how do you make sure that the federal government, which has not been executing as well as it could be in the first year of the pandemic,
That's an understatement.
does better?
Yeah. So look, we said we were coming into office to tackle 4 crises: the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, the climate crisis, and a crisis of racism in the United States. But it was clear to us that the COVID crisis was the first crisis you had to attack, because if you couldn't get COVID into a better place, it would deeply impair your ability to address any of these other crises. So we put COVID first. And I had very strong views about how we should structure the COVID response from my experience coordinating the U.S. participation in the worldwide Ebola response in 2014, 2015. I thought we needed a strong unit at the White House with a centralized coordinator to really drive action across the government, that parking at Health and Human Services wasn't good enough. It had to be right at the White House. Had to have someone who really knew how to get all the agencies to work together. That fundamentally pandemic response is much more about logistics than it is about healthcare in many ways. You didn't need scientists, you need logisticians to make sure we're getting things where they needed to be, getting people the help they needed. It was complicated, it was interagency, it was intergovernmental, and the only place we could drive that was out of the White House with a strong, well-coordinated response. And so so I asked Jeff Zients, who was running the transition, to step aside running the transition and take over and build our COVID response unit at the White House and lead it, be the first leader of the COVID response unit. And early on, we had this big debate. The central debate was, did the Trump administration have a vaccine distribution plan that they were refusing to share with us, which we thought was the case in the first instance, and I came to believe they just didn't have a plan at all. They weren't sharing with us because it didn't exist. And in fact, I think history's proven that I was right in that proposition. Their plan was that as the vaccine got manufactured, they'd simply deliver it to state public health departments and hope that state public health departments could distribute the vaccine. And, I like state public health departments, but the idea that we were going to deliver them hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine and have them distribute it seemed like an improbable outcome. And in fact, as December came along and the vaccine started to become available, what we found was that we didn't have enough vaccine, point one, and point two, that very little of it was getting into people's arms. We got to the end of December, and of the limited amount of vaccine that had been produced, less than half of it had actually been administered. So the Trump plan, the non-plan, was a bad plan, or not a plan, whatever you want to call it. But we decided we needed a new approach. And so we centered in on the idea of focusing our distribution on commercial pharmacies, which had obviously strengths and weaknesses. The strengths were there are a lot of commercial pharmacies in America. They give a lot of shots all the time. They know how to do it, and they're in a lot of places. You didn't have to build them, and you didn't have to tell people where they were, because one thing commercial pharmacies do is they do a good job of letting you know where they are. It's in their interest to tell you where the local CVS is, where the local Walgreens is, and they give people tens of millions of flu shots a year. So giving shots is something they do at scale, and they have the infrastructure. So that was where we started. And we realized there were still a lot of underserved communities that weren't going to be served if we went that model. So we started to use a lot more public health clinics as a secondary distribution model. And then we had some temporary FEMA-built mass vaccination sites, not because they distributed so many shots, but because they were highly visible. It was serving public education function. People turn on their TV, they see people lined up to go into football stadiums and whatnot, and they were like, oh, the vaccine's available, I can go get it there. And if they then went and got their shot at their local CVS, it was an awareness thing, if not actually much of an administration thing. So we centered on that on our strategy and started to execute in December and January. So when we took office in January, we were ready to acquire a lot more vaccine and begin to distribute it in a widespread way.
So one of the, and you've begun to answer this, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's important. One of the criticisms was people said, Jeff's science. Jeff doesn't have a public health background.
Yeah.
He's not a physician. Why would you have him leading a public health response, a COVID response that is clearly a public health crisis? So reflections on that. And I know you started that, but just build on that.
So again, maybe it's a little too self-referential, but it reflected my experience in leading our Ebola response. I knew nothing about public health or Ebola or whatever, but the challenges there were largely logistical, how you could get medical aid across the ocean to West Africa and how you could work with the countries there to help fight that epidemic. And that was a big logistic challenge more than anything else. With COVID, I felt even more strongly that way. The vaccine had been developed and the FDA had approved it for emergency use at least. We had Dr. Tony Fauci as the president's chief medical advisor. We had the CDC, we had the FDA. We had a lot of doctors working in the White House and the administration. That wasn't the challenge. The challenge was if you could get your hands on 150 million doses of vaccine, how could you actually get it in people's arms? And that was a big logistical challenge. How do you distribute it? How do you administer it? And so we needed someone who understood how to make the government work, how to make all the different agencies of the government work together, how to coordinate that. And that was Jeff's strong suit, and he did a very good job on it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has been largely underappreciated is how quickly Americans actually got vaccinated.
Yeah.
Because people often talk about the polio vaccine as like the gold standard and the lines. It took us about 5-6 years to get a vast majority of kids vaccinated against polio after the polio vaccine became available. And we had, 70% of adults by like April or May of 2021. So like 5 months after taking office. I think you made this point, I don't know if it was in one of your tweets, it was probably in one of your tweets. Ron likes to tweet a lot. But you made the point that that level of vaccination was not a given the public health infrastructure that we have in our country.
Yeah, look, I think there are great things about the American healthcare systems and there are weaknesses. One weakness we have is which is also a strength, is we have a highly decentralized system. So I remember when I worked on the Ebola response, I talked to my colleagues in the United Kingdom, who are key partners of ours. They have a national healthcare system. Everyone knows where they get all their healthcare treatments. It's a place, and it's a single national system. And if the national healthcare system says we're giving out vaccines, this is where we're giving them out, this is how we're giving them out, they have a unified system. We don't have that in America. We have a highly decentralized system. It's both public and private. It's local, it's state, it's federal. And so, so no one can sit in the White House and say, okay, every federal healthcare clinic is going to make this service available tomorrow, and here's how you're going to get it. So, that makes, I think, the diversity of our system makes it much harder to deal with a crisis like this. It gives it more resilience because, if one part of the system fails, there's, no other part of the system depends on it. One hospital's gone, there are other hospitals, whatever. So I think that, our system has its strengths and weaknesses. For this purpose, it was just much harder to do a command control response to an epidemic like this. You had to figure out how to use the system we had. And as I said, I thought my view with regard to administering the vaccine was the strongest asset we had was commercial pharmacies because they knew how to do it and they're very large and there's a lot of them.
There is a lot of them. And as you said, they're very, very good at reminding everybody that they're
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Because they love people coming in and getting their vaccines, because then they also pick up some other stuff along the way.
exactly.
Maybe one kind of more question sticking on this, and I want to shift gears a little bit. You alluded to this, but if you could flesh it out a bit more. You were the Ebola response coordinator
I was.
under President Obama. I remember the criticism then, like, Ron Klain, what does he know about public health? Why is there not a public health person running the response? And some of this is setting up a question where you eventually went to a public health person to run a response. So something about your thinking changed, so we'll come back to that. But how do you feel like that experience running the Ebola response both affected your COVID response thinking, and so you've talked about that a little bit, but what do you think it taught you about the American healthcare system that you didn't know before before you became the Ebola response coordinator?
Well, it taught me a lot about the American healthcare system that I didn't know before. President Obama, I was minding my own business sitting at my desk in October of 2014 when my phone rang, and it was the president who I knew and who worked for, and he said, I need you to come back and I want you to run the Ebola response. I was like, well, I don't know, Mr. President, it seems like a big problem I know nothing about. And he said, well, it is a big problem. And I said, well, I think this is a bad idea. I think that if you pick someone who doesn't know about Ebola or public health, you're going to get criticized and I'm going to get criticized. And he said, well, Ron, here's what I think. I think you'll do a great job. And if you do, no one will remember that you got criticized on the first day. And if you don't, the fact that you get criticized for doing it is the least of my problems. So I said, okay, seems good. And look, the problem we had with the Ebola response was, and Beth Cameron's here, who was already hard at work on this when I came into the government, did a fantastic job. The problem we had was we have what we call a whole of government response, which means virtually every agency in the federal government had a piece of it. And the problem was they weren't working together, and there were a lot of interagency problems. And there wasn't really a good mechanism for solving those problems. So for example, in West Africa, we had USAID, their disaster response teams on the ground, doing some of the hardest work you could imagine, out in the middle of very remote areas, trying to help people deal with it. And then we had, for the first time ever, President Obama had deployed troops in an epidemic response, Operation United Assistance, with 3,000 U.S. troops on the ground in West Africa. And the question was, if the DART teams took blood samples, could the military fly helicopters in and retrieve the blood samples and fly them to labs across the country? And that was a question for the military to answer, and the USAID people couldn't really talk to the military people. And so we needed to coordinate that out of the White House. We needed to coordinate across the whole government. There were all kinds of problems like that every day. Craig Spencer's here, one of my heroes. And Craig came back from fighting Ebola in West Africa and got Ebola, and he got treated effectively at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. But treating an Ebola patient creates a lot of medical waste, and you have to dispose of that medical waste. And the infectious disease experts said the only safe way to dispose of it was to incinerate it. But incinerating it was illegal under New York law. So we had a lot of medical waste, and it needed to be incinerated, and it couldn't be incinerated in New York. Well, there was an incinerator in Louisiana that was willing to incinerate it. They had incinerated chemical weapons from Syria that we had captured. So they were used to doing very unsafe things much more unsafe than incinerating medical waste. They were willing to do it. The problem is, for those of you, I know this is a public health program, but for those who know something about geography, Louisiana and New York are not necessarily close together. So you had to get the medical waste from New York to Louisiana to incinerate it. And that meant putting it in a truck and driving it. And that meant driving it through many states. A lot of governors decided that they would score political points by saying, you couldn't drive the Ebola waste truck through my state. So we had to figure out what was the route to get it from New York to Louisiana. That involved the transportation department. And so we had, every department of the federal government working on different parts of this problem. And it was, as I said, you didn't need to be a public health expert to know that there were roads from New York to Louisiana, and you couldn't take it through Tennessee, so you had to figure out how to get it there, and you had to coordinate with the governors of other states. So there were a lot of logistical problems like that. And so, what I learned was that, again, our healthcare system is highly decentralized. I'll tell one other story from this period, which was, one of the challenges we had was getting people to do what Dr. Spencer did, which is be willing to give up their lives and their practices and their families and go to West Africa and help fight Ebola. It was not a very attractive offer, which is go leave your family, go leave what you're doing, go leave your practice if you're a doctor, and go across the ocean to fight a disease that's a dangerous disease and a very difficult condition where I couldn't really promise it would be safe and whatever. We had to solicit people to do that. And when we were calling hospital systems and trying to get them to send volunteers and nurses and so on and so forth. And every week, as I said, I'd talk to my counterparts in the UK, and they'd say, "How are you doing on that?" I'd say, "Well, we got a couple hundred volunteers, and I've been making calls all day, all night, and we're making progress." I'd say, "How are you doing?" He said, "Well, we called up the NHS. We told them to send 200 people, and they sent 200 people. They're sending 200 people tomorrow." I'm like, "That's great. That's really cool difference between our systems." And I was very jealous of their system. I was talking to random hospitals all over the country, begging for 5 people at a time, and my UK counterpart was just calling up the NHS and sending 200 people. And then one day before Christmas, one of the nurses from the British Health Service got Ebola, and the NHS union decided they were going to send no more people. And so once they decided they weren't sending any more people, that was it. My counterpart in the UK had nowhere to go. Whereas in our system, if one hospital or one medical center refused to send volunteers, there were hundreds of others who could send volunteers. And so the diversity of our system makes it much harder to kind of produce a mass response, but it gives it more resilience in the face of adversity. So that was a lesson I learned then. But I think that in the end, what I'll say to people who are in global health students and global health involved in global health movement, the U.S. is an indispensable nation in this. I think if we had not led on the Ebola response, it would be very hard to get other European nations to lead. We played a critical role in terms of the infrastructure of the response. In the end, the heroes of the Ebola response were people of West Africa themselves, who took action in their communities, who treated, who were the tip of the spear, treating people who were sick with Ebola, and who changed cultural practices to end the transmission of the disease. But we provided a critical backbone and infrastructure for those people. We built Ebola treatment units. We sent our troops to help provide security and make sure that roads existed and the infrastructure existed. And our leadership was absolutely critical in that moment to galvanizing the world, to supporting the nations of West Africa and doing the hard work and beating this difficult disease in their own countries.
And that global leadership, talk a little bit about how that plays out in the COVID response. The president's commitment for the first 500 million doses, followed by another 500 million doses a few months later, bringing European countries sort of into that fold. That was a tough moment. You were also getting criticism, because you get criticism for pretty much everything you do. But how did you think about the U.S.'s global responsibility and bringing other countries along to make sure there's much more of a global response, certainly on the vaccine front?
Yeah, look, I think that we go through this every time we have an epidemic. You can have travel restrictions, they have some modest impact, but in the end, it's an interconnected globe. And if there's an epidemic in some part of the world, it's eventually going to wind up here. And, we're too interconnected as a country to the rest of the world to think we can put up our walls and not have diseases wind up here. It's the only way for the American people to be safe is to fight disease around the world. And I think that was obviously true for Ebola. It was certainly true for COVID. And so we knew we needed to vaccinate people in other countries. We had to get our own vaccine situation in order first, to have the political support to send vaccine overseas. I think it's important for us to lead the world in capacity building. It felt awkward with developing nations that they were dependent on us for vaccine, and you'd have these conversations about, we're giving people 2 shots here, 3 shots here before people get their first shots in other places, and these horrible trade-offs and choices. And the only way to solve that problem is to make sure that we make vaccines all over the world, to make sure that developing nations have access to the intellectual property and the capacity to make those vaccines, and that they can, be there themselves. In the COVID response, we had this horrible scenario where the Indians thought they could make their own vaccine and supply the Indian subcontinent with vaccine. Then it turned out their manufacturing capacity wasn't as great as they thought it was, and instead of being a vaccine maker and exporter, they wound up being a vaccine importer. And with a country the size of India, that flip was a giant flip in the global supply situation. So it's not just enough to build factories overseas. They have to be effective, they have to work well, and they have to have, obviously, the IP and the expertise to produce it. We had that problem even in the United States, where we couldn't get enough vaccine production ramped up, and and we started to use contract manufacturing. Some of it was
And
good,
even
some of it wasn't.
our Johnson & Johnson vaccine, like
Yeah.
there were huge problems in producing those, and Novavax. Like,
Yeah.
it's just a reminder, as one of my friends who works on vaccine development said, for vaccines, the process is the product. It's not like drugs. It actually is much, much harder to make. And we saw a bunch of U.S. manufacturers struggle, so no surprise that we saw something similar. Okay, a couple more quick questions, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, because I do want questions from students and others who are here. So going back to this argument of the response coordinator needed to be somebody who knew how to make the government run, who knew how to do interagency, who could drive things. And this is not a personal question, though of course it is a deeply personal question. But at some point you changed your view on that. And as Jeff stepped down, you decided to go for somebody who has very little government experience, who is much more of a public health person. And so tell me about your shift in thinking there.
Yeah.
And is that a more generalizable thing, that in the early days you need somebody who can build the government infrastructure, but maybe over time you need somebody with more subject matter expertise? Or how do you think about that?
Well, here's how I thought about it. I remember during the transition in December and January of 2020, people started to ask me, well, are you going to have vaccine mandates? And I was like, look, we don't have enough vaccine. We have tens of millions of people in line waiting for a vaccine. We don't need to order anybody to get a vaccine. What we need to do is we need to get them manufactured. We need to make them available for people. And then, of course, we got to the summer of 2021, and we were a very different situation. We had plenty of vaccine. We had a great distribution mechanism, and people weren't taking the vaccine. And the country was getting more divided about masking, of course, about vaccines and vaccine mandates. And we knew that antiviral treatment was coming online some point in time in the next year. And I was determined that we wouldn't have the same kind of polarization around that we had around masking and vaccines. And so we went from our logistics were good, our system of manufacturing and distributing stuff was good. I thought we needed a different kind of leader when Jeff left, which is we needed someone who could engage the public and hopefully build more consensus around the response and really get people to understand why the vaccination was safe and effective, and why it was, even though it didn't prevent you from getting sick, why it's still something you should get. Because that was, I think, the single biggest thing that happened in COVID was when people heard vaccine, certainly when I heard vaccine in December and January of 2021, I thought you'd get the shot, then you wouldn't get COVID. That's what most vaccines do for us. Unfortunately, people got the shot and you still got COVID. And that really messed up people's heads and messed up people's thinking about it. And so we faced what I thought was really a public health challenge. I thought the logistical systems working, the government was doing its job, but we had a crisis in public health, which was we had a safe and effective and free vaccine and people weren't taking it. And I thought you, Ashish, would be the right leader to help us get through that moment.
So that gets us to maybe my last question, which is, when I think about my time at the White House and when I think about things that I wish had turned out differently, I went in, I think, more optimistic that I could help bridge the partisan divide than I think it turned out. And I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about that, spent a lot of time thinking about what could I have done differently. That's not this question. The question is, when you think about public health measures, it's always been sort of people on the fringes who've been pretty anti-public health, but it has never felt quite as partisan as it does right now. And the question for you is that just sort of the sign of the times that everything is going to get partisanized? Or is there a path forward that makes public health less partisan, cuts across the political spectrum more effectively? Maybe you won't pick up the fringes, but that we can create a coalition for public health that really brings reasonable people across the political spectrum together.
Look, I think the fundamental challenge here is that public health is fundamentally a communitarian endeavor. We're a very individualistic society. And I think that tension always exists. As I said, I grew up in Indiana, and my first big experience with public health out there was we had a scenario where the entire state legislature turned over because the public revolted against a motorcycle helmet requirement in the state. And if you think about things, public health interventions that seem relatively simple, not that intrusive, save a lot of lives. People requiring people to wear a helmet when they ride a motorcycle, it's not like getting into people's intimate private lives. It doesn't seem it's that intrusive. It seems like a pretty reasonable measure, reasonable public health measure. State passed it, and the voters voted the legislature out of office because they wanted the motorcycle helmet repealed. And so, there's always that tension in American life between our strong sense of individualism and individual rights and the idea that public health fundamentally is about the community. And I think that tension exists. I think right now we're polarized as a country, and that exacerbates this. But as you alluded to, you saw this with the polio vaccine in a time we think of as the golden era of American monoculture in the 1950s. The reason famously Elvis Presley went on the Ed Sullivan Show and got vaccinated was because the vaccine had languished for 7 years with a low level of vaccination. So they had to send Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show to get vaccinated. It's not a public health success. It was a failure of 7 years of public health experience. And so, vaccine resistance is as old as the country itself. Goes back to George Washington's time. But I think this tension between the communitarian element of public health and the individualistic nature of American character and psyche, it will always be there, and now it's doubled down with this political polarization around these issues.
Yeah, great. All right, I'm going to open up to questions. We have about 20 minutes. People have questions. You can put up your hand. Is there somebody with mics running? Oh, we have runners with mics. Anyone want to ask Ron Klain a question? All right, while people are thinking about it and gathering their oh, we got one right here. Patrick Whitney. Yeah, can you get Patrick a mic?
So there's incredible science that goes into the creating a vaccine. But you pointed out that we were not as good at getting people to put it in their arms and take it. Do you see a way that we could prototype things or try things differently to understand human foibles to get things like vaccines more accepted?
Well, we went through several phases on this, and first it was, once it goes from EUA to full approval, maybe that'll change people's minds, and it just didn't. We went through a phase where governors were giving away money if you got vaccinated, including like in Ohio, they had like $1 million giveaway. They would pull a random person who just got vaccinated, give them $1 million, lottery vaccination, tuition assistance vaccinations. And then, of course, we ultimately tried to impose mandates, which courts struck down. So, I will say anything I've ever thought of, we tried in the summer of 2021, from stronger regulatory backing to paying people to do it to threatening people if they didn't do it, and it just didn't. Nothing got. As she said, we got a lot of it done, and the level of vaccination was higher, faster than any prior vaccination program. But even so, the holdouts just wouldn't budge, and in some ways, the harder we pushed them, the more they resisted. So, I don't know what the right answer is.
All right, we see a few hands back there. Sorry, I've got something in my throat. And if you could just introduce yourself. That'd be great.
Hi, I'm Abdullah. I got my MPH here, and I work here as a staffer. So my question is on health equity. I know during the COVID pandemic, we saw huge disparities with Black and Latino and Indigenous people dying at higher rates and also happening to be less vaccinated. Could you talk more about the health equity efforts, what you learned, and what you think the White House could have done better? Thank you.
Thanks. So when we came in, the disparity in vaccination rates between white people and people of color in this country was enormous. And the president said that was one of the first things we had to address. And so one thing you learn is you have to give people health care where they get it. And we found that in communities of color, there was more resistance to the commercial pharmacies. There was a sense that they weren't welcome there or that they weren't well deployed in their communities. So we focused on where people of color got their health care. We did a lot with public health clinics. We worked with community groups. We worked with the Black churches, which often ran different kinds of health fairs, healthcare clinics, to have them administer the vaccine at their existing community programs. And we made it a priority and a focus. And the president hired a health equity coordinator to work on the COVID response team. And I think, first of all, making it a priority made a difference. Again, bringing it into communities geographically made a difference, and using existing distribution mechanisms that serve the communities made a difference. But I think you have to focus on it. If you don't focus on it, it's not going to happen. One of the problems we had, obviously, was when you have these public health facilities in communities, in some Latino communities, where there's anxiety about immigration enforcement, people would be scared to come. So we had made very clear we were doing no immigration enforcement at the vaccine clinics. So you could come, no one would ask your immigration status, we'd just give you the shot. And that helped increase our take-up rate among Hispanics. And so I think now we're at a place where blacks and Hispanics are more vaccinated than whites in America. And so we made a lot of progress on health equity with regard to the vaccine. We have a giant health equity problem in this country, across the board. And I think it's important for the government to be very focused on closing those gaps. But the COVID response showed it's possible to close those gaps.
And the example I want to use on this is, so when I came in, we had a lot of Paxlovid. We were using almost no Paxlovid. So we very, very quickly ramped up the availability of treatments. And I had my weekly COVID meeting with Ron. And I will say this, he was a little bit tough with us at times. And one of the things was, as I showed him data on, like, look at this incredible uptake of Paxlovid, he's like, great, break it down for me by communities of color, by social vulnerability. And sure enough, when we did, we saw that initially everybody was low, and as it rose, you could see the gap starting to happen. And then we had to come back the week after and give him a plan of how are we going to close those gaps. So the point on this is, we have a deeply inequitable system that pre-exists. And anytime you implement a policy, you are going to get inequitable outcomes kind of as a natural course. And the job of government then becomes identify those early, come up with strategies to overcome it, and close those gaps. And I felt like that was part of my accountability mechanism. And you and the president, and we did the same thing with Mpox, with monkeypox. I remember the conversation with the president as we created a new team. He was like, look, we got to get this under control. We got to make sure we get it under control for communities of color. It is about prioritizing it and then holding people accountable for it. At least that was my experience. All right, other questions? Katie Biello.
Sort of the lack of infrastructure or the ability for state public health organizations to implement the vaccines. And I'm just curious, looking forward, if you see the political will or where we need to go in order to ensure that in the future our public health infrastructure is more prepared, better funded, and more nimble.
Well, Katie, I wish I could be more optimistic on that. I think right now, this is, as Ashish alluded to, it's a highly partisanized, highly polarized issue. And I'm not sure how we got there to where, without, I don't want to sound super partisan, but you turn on Republican presidential debates and, the Republicans running for president are debating, are attacking Trump for being too responsive to COVID, and he should have done even less. Governor DeSantis seems to base his entire campaign on the idea that after a year he was just completely hands off on COVID, and that was brilliant. This has become a highly partisanized endeavor right now. I think it's important for public health to emphasize that it's not a bunch of expert people at pointy-headed places like Brown trying to tell people what to do, but that public health is about protecting other people. I think we kind of lost that narrative in COVID a little bit. Whether or not the reason we were trying to implement all these policies was to force people to make better choices for themselves or to truly protect the public at large. I think the more it's about, hey, we need people to do this so that other people don't get sick, I think the more openness there is to public health interventions. I think the more it's like we're trying to tell you, live your life this way, the more it seems like we're trying to tell people how to live their lives. And I think that's a tension. With COVID, it became confusing because at first the public health community, this is before we came into office, we're telling people not to wear masks at all. I think that was more driven by a fear that there was a short supply of masks for healthcare professionals, and so they didn't want random people buying up all the masks so that people in hospitals didn't have them. For whatever reason, they said, don't wear masks. And then we told people, well, you need to wear a mask because your mask protects other people. And we got very confusing about why you're wearing a mask. Are you wearing a mask to protect yourself? Are you wearing a mask to protect someone else? I think there's more openness to public health interventions when it's like, you need to do this to protect other people. You think about the debate about vaccines and mandates around schools. I think, even in states that didn't love the COVID vaccine mandates, there's still more support for school vaccine mandates on the thought that, well, you shouldn't send your kid to school and get my kid sick. And I think, as long as we kind of frame things that way, it helps people understand why these public health interventions exist.
Wilmot. Oh, sorry, and then after Wilmot, we'll go back there.
Oh, okay. Thank you for being here. My name is Patricia Hung. I'm a student here. This question isn't so much about public health, but more about your role as chief of staff. And I just want to preface this by saying that Josh Bolton once came to visit our class, and we asked him the same question, so I also want to ask you. And from your point of view, who do you think is the best living chief of staff, and why? Other than yourself, of course.
Well, thank you for that very hard question. I was the White House chief of staff who had worked for more other chiefs of staff than anyone else before they got the job, which just shows if you hang around long enough, eventually you get the job. I'll just say for myself, what I found most important was to build a strong team. I have a lot of confidence in myself. I'm not an overly modest person, but the problems were way too hard for me to solve by myself. We needed a great team. And to me, the linchpin of that was diversity. The White House, when I was the chief of staff, was the first time ever where majority of the staff was female, majority of the senior staff was female, and a majority of the president's senior advisors were female. In addition, we had great diversity on race and all kinds of other demographic factors. It was important to also have diversity of background. We had scientists, we had people with business backgrounds, we had people with government backgrounds, we had activists, we had all kinds of people with different backgrounds. And I think diversity makes a team stronger. It brings expertise and point of view you don't have otherwise. And I relied very heavily on a very diverse, very skilled team to make the White House work when I was there. And so that's my only insight on that I can offer.
Professor James, and then we'll go back there.
So my name is Walmart James, and I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Klain, for your leadership. It's been admirable. So I'm a professor of practice in the School of Public Health. I'm also a former member of Parliament from South Africa. South African scientists did really well. They established circulation of Omicron, and then a travel ban was imposed in South Africa. I was in Cape Town at the time, the Western Cape. One of the economic drivers is tourism. It dried up, so the economic losses were severe. Would you please comment on that? That a country gets punished for being transparent, and also share the genome sequence immediately, and then that happened.
Yeah. I've been reading Franklin Foer's book about the first 2 years of the Biden administration. I just got, actually today on the plane flight up here, got to the chapter about Omicron and November of 2021, and I remember this I refreshed my recollection on this very, very much, which was Thanksgiving weekend of 2021. We're just kind of eventually getting the Delta variant a little bit under control in America, and word came of a new variant from South Africa. There had been a lot of speculation about a variant that would evade the vaccine, and fears that Omicron was that variant. And the reports from South Africa was that the variant was spreading rapidly, and it might even be more, and it could be also more severe. And we didn't know if the vaccine provided protection or not. And the President asked Dr. Fauci, well, how can we figure this out? I said, well, we'll have to sequence the vaccine from South Africa, test it against the vaccine, sequence the virus from South Africa and test it against the vaccine. And we need 3 weeks to figure out if the vaccine gives people even any protection at all from this new variant. And so it was a very tough choice, but the view was to impose a very short-term travel ban on travel to South Africa, from South Africa, to limit the introduction of this new variant until we had a better sense of whether or not our tools protected us. As I said earlier, travel restrictions, I think, are a very ineffective tool to prevent the spread of disease. But in that case, I thought a short-term restriction on travel to and from South Africa until we had a better understanding of what we were dealing with, until we had a better understanding whether or not our vaccine worked, was a justifiable, if blunt, instrument to try to slow the spread of Omicron in the U.S. until we knew what we were dealing with. And it wasn't an easy choice for us to do. I agree, travel bans in some ways punish countries for disclosing to the world that this virus exists. They can be counterproductive that way. I think it's hard to look people in the eye and say, hey, there's this new variant, it's coming from this place, and we don't know if the vaccine works or not, but we're just not going to do anything as we wait 2 or 3 weeks to find out. So it seemed like the one intervention we could make that would slow the pace of Omicron. I think it did slow it a little bit. There was already a lot of Omicron in the United States when we implemented it. We didn't know that. But I do think it was the right decision given the facts that we had at that time. And notwithstanding, I agree absolutely that there are negatives to it, and it definitely hurt our allies in South Africa and definitely made people feel like they had done the right thing by reporting the existence of this variant, and we had punished them for doing that, which we're just using the limited tools we had at that time.
See a couple of hands back there. Yep, go ahead, Karen.
Hi, my name is Avital. I'm a first-year student at Brown. Really glad to be here. Thanks so much for coming. You were Chief of Staff when Roe v. Wade got overturned and the U.S. entered in a unique public health crisis of epic proportions that, of course, has been politicized and polarized. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what that experience was like for you in the White House and what you see the path forward looking like from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. One challenge we faced when we came into office was the White House is essentially an in-person workplace because of classified information and security measures. We couldn't just have people taking their work at home, and because communications had to be secured, you couldn't have people just zooming all their classified information all over the Zoom, and so we had to have people work on site even before we had people vaccinated. And so we had very rigorous masking and distancing policies until we got people vaccinated. And even after we got people vaccinated, we tried to have a lot of masking and distancing in the White House. And it was tough to manage the White House during the pandemic. It was tough because one thing about working at the White House is people like to work there because you have big social events and you invite people in, and you're working hard, long hours, but then like stars come or there are special events to celebrate things. We couldn't do any of those events. And so it was White House was all work and no play. And it was hard to keep people feeling good about it, but I think people were there because they knew we had a very important mission to try to fight the pandemic, to fight the economic crisis, to try to help deal with civil rights issues, and to try to combat climate change. And as we made progress on those things, I think morale improved. But I wouldn't want to try to manage during a pandemic again. It added to the difficulty of a difficult task, that's for sure.
And over time, it got better.
Yes, it did get better.
It is not a work from home kind of environment. All right, we have a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi. Hello, my name is Amir. I'm a proto-historian, a junior in studying history. So my question is adjacent to the previous question, but it's about transgender people and how their rights have come under huge attacks, especially from the Republican Party during the last few years after their defeat in the election. Has the issue come up in the administration, maybe personally for President Biden, as a public health issue? And if not, I mean, that's fine. I just would like to know. If not, how has it come up? Has it come up at all? Or is the administration sensitive to this issue? Because as I'm experiencing it, the queer community in general is very, very anxious right now.
I'm sorry, I had a little trouble hearing your question.
I'm not totally following it either.
Sorry, what was you couldn't hear?
I couldn't hear the very end of your question at all. The sound was reverberating. maybe get rid of the microphone and just speak loudly.
Yeah, sure. So my question was about transgender people and how their rights in the last 3 years have been consistently under attack. And it's framed particularly by those who are attacking them as a sort of moral but also medical issue. Somewhat sort of similar and parallel to the vaccine issue which you talked about, that people are anxious that doctors are telling them how to live their lives. It's as if also the medical community is telling them how they should deal with their children's medical issues. Has this topic come up in the administration for President Biden, for you, for others, either as a public health issue or no, as a human rights issue, constitutional issue, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because the queer community is very anxious right now.
Yeah, I understand that. So, look, I think that protecting LGBTQ rights has been an important part of President Biden's agenda from the day he took office. And both through actions of the Education Department and Health and Human Services Department, he's taken steps to try to protect individual rights and protect the rights of transgender people. When I agree, they are under assault in our country, largely at the state and local level. Federal government's doing what it can to be helpful here, but I do think this is an important issue, and I think it's important for the administration to continue to stand strong on LGBTQ rights, as the administration has. But certainly I understand why people in the community are anxious about it, because there is a lot of political assault on this issue.
All right, one last question, and I'll let.
I just want us to bring up the question again because, Ron, I think you didn't hear it, and I think it's a really important question. So.
Okay, do you want to do it without the mic? Because it is hard to hear.
That's fine. So just focus on that.
So just to clarify, I was wondering if you could speak to the reproductive health care crisis that occurred in your time in office
Oh, reproductive.
when Roe v. Wade was overturned. I was wondering if you could specify as to what the environment in the White House was like during that time, what the lead-up looked like, if you were considering any other measures, and what the negotiations to find alternatives before the decision was made looked like, and then where you see our path going forward to ensure reproductive health care in the United States to look like.
Yeah, great question. So when the first draft of the Dobbs decision leaked, we convened a variety of working groups in the White House to be ready for the ultimate outcome, and leaned very hard on the Department of Health and Human Services and FDA to make sure they were taking steps to protect reproductive rights. And I met personally with the Attorney General and told him that the Justice Department had to protect women's rights to travel on an interstate basis if that's what they needed to, and to take action against any state efforts to restrict those rights. And I think we've seen attacks in the courts on mifepristone and the FDA's approval of it, and that continues to be litigated. But I think the FDA took steps to issue new REMS that hopefully will provide a basis for continued use of mifepristone. It is the principal way in which women access, the abortion rights in this country right now, and having it be safe and available, widely available in all parts of the country is very, very important. And the administration's worked very hard with providers to make it available in all 50 states, and to deal with state efforts to shut down access of mifepristone, and also to make sure it can be available on a remote basis through the mails and through other kinds of things. I think this is one of the great public health issues in our country right now, and I think the only real solution long term is to have a federal statute that protects reproductive rights. That's what President Biden is for, Vice President Harris is for, and we need a Congress that will pass a statute that takes Roe versus Wade and enshrines it back as the law of the land, and overrides state rights, state efforts to compress those rights. So this is a central focus at the White House. The President's Gender Policy Task Force, led by Jen Klain, who's a graduate of Brown University, I should say, leads this effort, and I think they're doing a good job under tough circumstances of continuing to try to do what they can to push back on these state restrictions.
Yeah, I was going to add, and you got there. This is the first president that has had a gender policy council. Yeah. Jen is awesome. She is a Brown grad. And for the entire time I was there, this was not obviously the primary focus of my work, But it was very, very clear from the time the Dobbs, but even before the Dobbs leak, it was very, very clear that the administration was going to do everything it can. At the end of the day, these are complex issues that require Congress, but I never saw anything but kind of unwavering support for doing everything we can to expand reproductive freedom and reproductive rights for women across the country, and I think that was clear. But this is going to be a battle. This is not a until there is a federal statute. I think it's going to continue to be a challenge and a fight on a state-by-state basis. And the whole mifepristone going after FDA's regulatory authority has all sorts of other problems that we've got to fight back against. So, all right, let me just wrap up here by saying, Ron, thank you in a huge way for coming to Brown. I hope your first visit was a good one, and maybe we can entice you to come back again. Look, one of the things in our country, we have these kind of big debates about the role of government, and should we have government do this, and should the government do that? And it has always struck me that if you are somebody who believes that the government has an important role to play in our country in fixing problems, in providing a safety net, in helping our country be a more equitable, more effective, more efficient country, then you need an effective government. And I want to thank you. I have never met anybody who has been as focused on making sure the government actually delivers for people in the way you have. And I want to say thank you for that. Thank you for leading our country through probably one of the darkest and most difficult moments of our country. And thank you for coming and spending some time with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ashish. I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank everyone for being here on a beautiful day, being inside and listening to this. I also want to thank Ashish particularly because one thing the government needs to be effective is to have outstanding experts from critical fields to be willing to give up their lives and their wonderful lives here at a place like Brown to come work in a small piece of square footage in the White House and work away 24/7 on these hard problems. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Ashish for doing that, and grateful to Brown for letting him do that. And I think it's great to have him back here, but his service in leading the COVID response was absolutely critical to making the progress we've made. And Beth Cameron, who was a colleague in both the Obama and the Biden administration, it's great to see her here. And I hope all of you who are interested in public health and global health think about public service as part of that, because I do think we need great people in the government. And it doesn't have to be your whole career. It doesn't have to be what you give your whole life to, but finding some time in your career to serve in the government, I think, is a very worthwhile endeavor. It's something we need outstanding people like the people in this audience to do. So thank you, Ashish, for that, and thank you to all of you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.